I never thought I would fall victim to one of those Craigslist horror stories you hear about, the ones that are always shared as cautionary tales, warning you to be careful who you meet online. I always thought those stories were overblown, too dramatic, and that I was smarter than that. But then, one night, I found myself standing in a stranger's living room, realizing too late that my whole life was about to be completely upended. It all started a few weeks ago. I had just moved to a new city for work, and I needed a place to stay. I was fresh out of college, and my budget was tight. Rent prices in the area were sky high, and I wasn't sure how I was going to make it work. So one night, I did what any desperate person would do. I hopped on Craigslist. I was scrolling through the listings when I saw an ad that caught my attention. It read, "Room for rent, quiet area, close to work, $300 a month." It seemed almost too good to be true, especially in a city where rooms typically ran for over $1,000 a month. Curious, I clicked on the ad. The description was short but vague. Looking for a roommate, must be clean and respectful, no pets, available now. There was a picture attached, just a photo of a modest living room with a couch and a coffee table. The furniture looked old, but everything seemed tidy. I sent the landlord, or whoever posted the ad, a message asking for more details. I figured there was no harm in seeing the place in person. Almost immediately, I got a response. "Hey, the room is still available. Can you come by tonight at 7 p.m.? If that works, I can give you the address." Something about the response felt a little rushed, but I shrugged it off. I was eager to secure a place to live. I agreed to the time and asked for the address. I showed up at 7 p.m. sharp. The house was located on a quiet street, a little out of the way, but still in the city. As I walked up the driveway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house looked abandoned. There were no lights on, and the lawn was overgrown with weeds. I was starting to feel nervous, but I told myself it was probably just an old house. I rang the doorbell, and after a moment, the door opened. The man who answered the door looked like he was in his mid-40s, maybe a bit older. He was tall, with a scruffy beard, and his eyes were dark and unblinking. His shirt was stained, and he had a disheveled appearance, as if he hadn't bothered to clean up for the visit. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey, you must be my name, right?" he said, his voice low and raspy. "Come on in. I'm Rick." I hesitated for just a second, but then I forced a smile and stepped inside. The interior of the house was dimly lit, and the walls were covered with yellowing wallpaper. It smelled faintly of mildew, and I couldn't tell if that was a bad sign or just something that came with old houses. Rick led me into the living room, where he motioned for me to sit on the couch. I did, trying to ignore the strange feeling in my stomach. "So what do you think?" Rick asked. "The room's upstairs, but I wanted to get your impression of the place first." I nodded, trying to act nonchalant. "It's nice," I said. "A little older than I expected, but it's cozy." Rick smiled again. "Yeah, it's a little rough around the edges, but it's cheap, and you can't beat the location. The room itself is pretty spacious, and it's got a lot of natural light." He then gestured for me to follow him. "Come on, I'll show you." We walked upstairs, and I was struck by how quiet the house was. No sounds of traffic, no voices. It was eerily still. Rick showed me the room. It was small, but there was a bed already in it, a dresser, and a desk. The light coming through the window wasn't as bright as he'd promised, but it was decent enough. There was a small closet, and the whole room had an old, musty smell. "It's perfect," I said, not wanting to seem ungrateful. I needed this place. "How much is the rent again?" $300 a month, Rick said. "And that includes utilities." It sounded too good to be true, but I was desperate, and I didn't want to ask too many questions. Besides, he seemed nice enough, even if there was something a little off about him. I agreed to move in, and that's when things started to take a strange turn. The first few days went by without incident. I stayed in my room, only coming out to grab food or take a shower. Rick would sometimes invite me to hang out in the living room, but I kept to myself mostly. He was always polite, but kept his distance. There were times, though, when I would hear him talking to himself, muttering under his breath or having strange, one-sided conversations that didn't make much sense. One evening, as I was walking down the stairs to grab a snack, I overheard Rick talking to someone. I froze at the top of the stairs. The voices were muffled, but I could hear Rick's deep voice saying, "She doesn't know. She doesn't know what's coming." The other voice was indistinguishable, but Rick continued, "Soon she'll be just like the others." Chills ran down my spine. My heart began to race as I tiptoed down the stairs to the kitchen, where I grabbed a quick bite and rushed back upstairs to my room. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was talking to someone on the phone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next few days felt different. There was a strange tension in the air. Rick would give me strange looks, and his demeanor started to change. One night, I woke up to hear footsteps outside my door, the sound of someone pacing. I thought it was just my imagination, but then I heard the door handle jiggle. I held my breath, hoping it would stop. It did, but the feeling of dread stayed with me. That was the night I decided to look through Rick's things. I wasn't proud of it, but I couldn't stand the constant unease. I waited until he was out of the house, then went through his drawers. What I found was terrifying. There were stacks of old, yellowed newspapers, news stories about missing persons, people who had disappeared without a trace. Most of the names were from the area. Then I found a small notebook. I opened it, my hands trembling. It was filled with entries, all about me. It started with the day I moved in. There were detailed notes about my habits, what time I left the house, when I went to bed, and where I went on my days off. One entry read, "She's getting comfortable. Too comfortable." I slammed the notebook shut, my mind racing. I quickly put everything back and ran upstairs to my room. I locked the door behind me. My gut told me I had to leave, but I didn't know where I could go. The thought of going to the police crossed my mind, but what would I even say? They'd probably think I was overreacting. That night, I packed a bag. I couldn't stay there any longer. As I was about to leave, I heard a knock on my door. "My name, you okay?" Rick's voice was muffled, but I could hear the calmness in it, the kind of calmness that made my blood run cold. I didn't answer. I just stood there, holding my breath, praying he would leave. After what felt like an eternity, I heard his footsteps retreat down the hallway. I waited until I was sure he was gone before I opened the window and climbed out. I ran down the street, not stopping until I reached the nearest bus station. I didn't care where I went, just as long as it was far from that house. To this day, I don't know what happened to Rick or why he was watching me. I tried looking up his name online, but nothing came up. I never found out what he meant by the others or why he was obsessed with me. All I know is that I'm never going near Craigslist again.
Next story.
I don't know why I answered that Craigslist ad. It wasn't the smartest decision I've ever made, but at the time, I needed the money and it seemed harmless enough. It was a few months ago. I had just graduated college and was struggling to find a decent job. My student loans were piling up and rent was due. So when I saw an ad for easy money on Craigslist offering $300 for odd jobs in a quiet town a couple of hours away, I didn't hesitate. The ad said nothing about the specific tasks involved, but it promised quick cash for a few hours of work. I figured it was just some light housework or maybe moving some boxes, nothing too bad. The email from the poster, who went by Lana, was brief, but to the point. She gave me an address and told me to arrive at 10 a.m. the following morning. I was skeptical at first, but figured I'd give it a shot. I could always leave if things felt off. The drive was uneventful. The town was small, tucked away between rolling hills with old stone houses and narrow streets. It looked like something straight out of a painting. The kind of place you'd imagine a secret cottage hidden deep in the woods with nothing but the wind and birds for company. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. I arrived at the address, which was an old white house at the edge of town. The lawn was overgrown with weeds curling up against the front porch, and the windows were dark, like the house hadn't been lived in for years. Something about it seemed off. But I shook it off, trying to convince myself that it was just the setting, the small town vibe, the old houses, the isolation. I rang the doorbell, and a moment later, the door creaked open. "Hey, you must be the one who replied to the ad," Lana said, stepping into the doorway. She was a tall woman with long black hair and sharp features that seemed almost too perfect, as if someone had designed her in a dream. She was dressed in a simple white dress, and though her smile seemed welcoming, there was something unnerving about it. Her eyes, pale blue, seemed to linger on me just a little too long. Yeah, that's me. I'm Alex, I said, offering a tight smile. I'm here to help with the odd jobs. Oh, wonderful, she said. I hope you're ready for some interesting work. She stepped aside and motioned for me to enter. Come on in. The house smelled strange, like musty old books and incense. It felt cold inside, even though the day outside was warm and sunny. I couldn't help but notice the walls, which were covered in faded, peeling wallpaper, and the floor, creaky beneath my feet. There were no photographs or decorations, just bare furniture scattered around the rooms. It felt sterile in a way, like a house that was too empty to be lived in. Follow me, Lana said, leading me to the back of the house. I did as she asked, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. We entered a dimly lit room at the rear of the house. It was small, with a single window covered by heavy curtains. In the center of the room was an old wooden table, covered with strange symbols drawn in chalk. There were several candles placed around the table, and in the middle was a large, shallow bowl filled with what looked like water. The air felt thick, almost heavy, and the temperature seemed to drop as soon as I stepped in. What is this? I asked, confused. This is where the work begins, Lana said, her voice calm but oddly mechanical. You'll be helping me with a ritual. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I wasn't sure what I expected, but this was not it. A ritual? I repeated, my voice unsteady. She nodded, a look of satisfaction on her face. Yes, it's quite simple, really. I just need someone to help me with the process. It won't take long. I backed away slowly, my heart beginning to race. This was not what I signed up for. Look, I think I'll just go. I don't want to get involved in anything weird. Lana's smile vanished and her eyes hardened. I'm afraid you don't have a choice. You're already here and the ritual has already begun. You won't be leaving until it's finished. I turned to leave, but as I reached for the door, it slammed shut with a force that made me jump. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic started to rise in my chest as I pounded on the door, calling out for help, but there was no response. Lana's voice was eerily calm behind me. You can't leave, Alex. You've already agreed to help. I spun around to face her. What do you mean I've agreed? I never agreed to this. I just came here to do some odd jobs. She simply smiled, though her smile now looked twisted, as though something had changed within her. You answered my ad, didn't you? You agreed to help, and now you'll stay until the ritual is complete. It's the price you pay for curiosity. I didn't understand what she was talking about. I didn't want to understand. My mind raced as I scanned the room for a way out, but all I could see was the table with the strange symbols and the bowl of water at its center. Something wasn't right about that water. It seemed to shimmer, like it wasn't entirely liquid. Please, I begged, backing away. I didn't sign up for this. Let me go. I'll leave and I won't tell anyone. Lana took a step forward, her face unreadable. You don't understand. There's no leaving now. The ritual has already begun. I didn't know what she meant by that, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I bolted for the window, throwing myself against it with all my strength, but the glass didn't break, it didn't even crack. Instead, it felt as if the window had turned to stone beneath my hands. That's when I realized there was no way out. Lana moved closer and I could hear the whisper of her voice, like a low chant. The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls pressing in closer. The temperature continued to drop, and the air grew heavy with an unnatural pressure. The water in the bowl began to ripple, and I could swear I saw shapes moving beneath the surface, shapes that weren't human. No, this can't be happening, I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the thick silence of the room. Lana didn't respond. Instead, she raised her hands, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming force pull me toward the table. I tried to resist, but I couldn't. My body moved against my will, as if invisible hands were guiding me. Stay still, Lana said, her voice calm, soothing, as if she was putting a child to sleep. This will only hurt for a moment. And then, with a snap, the world around me went dark. I woke up hours later, or was it days? I couldn't tell. The room was the same, but I felt different. The air was thick, and I could still feel the weight of Lana's presence. I managed to get to my feet, my body heavy and unresponsive. My reflection in the mirror was distorted, my face a ghostly blur. That's when I realized the ritual was over. I had become part of it, and I was never going to leave.
Next story.
It was a late autumn evening when I made a decision I would come to regret for the rest of my life. I had been browsing Craigslist for a while, searching for a new roommate. The rent on my small apartment had been rising, and I needed someone to split the costs. A quick glance through the roommate section led me to an ad that seemed too good to be true. The listing was simple: room for rent, quiet neighborhood, private entrance, $500 a month, must be respectful and clean. It was posted just an hour ago. No photos, no further details, just a phone number. Something about it caught my attention. It was vague enough to feel like a good opportunity for someone like me, desperate but willing to take a chance. So I texted the number, and within minutes I had a reply. The response was short and to the point. Come by tomorrow at 7 p.m. I'll be home. That was it. No further information. But honestly, I didn't think much of it. The price was right, and I was running out of options. I'd always been a bit too trusting for my own good. The next evening, I drove to the address in a quiet suburban neighborhood, well outside the bustling city center. The houses were spaced out with large yards, and everything felt peaceful in the way suburban neighborhoods tend to. I parked in front of an old two-story house. It looked aged but well-maintained, the paint faded by years of weather. The lights inside were dim, but a faint glow seeped out from behind the curtains. I texted the number again. I'm here. A few seconds later, the front door opened. A man stood there, his face mostly hidden by the shadows, but I could see enough to tell he was probably in his early 40s, unshaven and wearing a plain sweatshirt. He smiled, though the smile felt more like a grimace than anything warm. You must be the one looking for the room, he said in a deep voice. It didn't sound friendly, more like a business transaction. Still, I was too tired and anxious to care about the small red flags creeping up in the back of my mind. I followed him inside. The house smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired out in days. The floors creaked under my feet as I walked through a narrow hallway into the living room. The walls were adorned with cheap, faded wallpaper, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. There was an eerie stillness in the air, the kind you notice when a house is either unnaturally clean or completely abandoned. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about this place felt off. Follow me, the man said, and I followed him upstairs to the second floor. He led me to a door at the end of the hall and opened it. It was a small, dark room with a twin bed against one wall. The sheets were old, the mattress lumpy. There was a single dresser, but that was about it. The room didn't have a closet, just a curtain that divided the space. This is it, he said, his voice low and almost rehearsed. You can have this room. The rent is $500 a month, but I'd prefer if you pay me in cash. I don't do checks. I nodded, still unsure, but feeling too desperate to question it. It's fine, I said, my voice trembling slightly. I just need a place. The man gave me a long, hard look, like he was assessing me in some way. There are a few rules, he said. You don't leave the house after dark, and you stay out of the basement. The neighbors are pretty nosy, so don't talk to anyone, and don't bring anyone over. I blinked, confused. Why? I don't have any plans to. Just don't, he interrupted. It's for your own good. I felt a chill run down my spine, but again, I ignored it. I needed a place to stay. I agreed to the rules, signed the lease, and handed over the first month's rent in cash. The man gave me a key and then walked me back to the front door. You start tomorrow, he said, before shutting the door behind me. I went back to my car, my mind racing with confusion and slight discomfort. I didn't feel great about it, but the rent was cheap and I had nowhere else to go. The next few days passed without much incident. I settled into my new room, barely interacting with the man. He seemed to be around a lot, often keeping to himself in the basement. I never saw anyone else come or go, which only added to the oddness of the place. The first time I broke one of his rules was when I found myself unable to resist the urge to explore the basement. I had been hearing strange noises coming from down there, scraping sounds, something that almost sounded like faint whispers. One evening, I decided to see what was going on. I tiptoed to the basement door and turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a dark staircase that descended into pitch blackness. I fumbled around my pockets for my phone and used its flashlight to illuminate the stairs. I crept down, heart pounding. The basement was cold, colder than the rest of the house. And as I reached the bottom, I saw something that made my stomach churn. There were old, rotting furniture scattered around, but that wasn't what made my skin crawl. What terrified me was the wall, lined with photographs. Some were old, others newer. Each one was of the same person, me. In every photo, I was either sleeping or doing something mundane, like cooking in the kitchen or sitting in my room. The worst part was that some of these photos had been taken when I hadn't even realized I was being watched. I stepped back in horror, heart racing. How long had he been watching me? How had he gotten these pictures? I turned and bolted up the stairs, my breath coming in panicked gasps. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound in the house seemed to set my nerves on edge. I kept hearing footsteps outside my door, soft whispers through the walls, but when I opened the door, no one was there. The next morning, I decided to confront the man. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. His room was eerily quiet. I decided to leave the house for a while, take a walk, get some fresh air to clear my mind. When I returned later, the front door was wide open and there was an odd smell in the air, something faintly metallic. I called out to him, but there was no response. Slowly, I walked through the house, the air growing colder with each step. I finally reached the basement door and froze. There, in the dim light of the basement, stood the man. But he wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the photographs on the wall. My photographs. I called out again, my voice shaky. "What's going on? What is this?" He turned, a twisted smile spreading across his face. "You're my perfect tenant," he whispered. "You've been here longer than I expected." I ran. I ran out of the house as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I never went back. I don't know what happened to him, but I saw his ad still up on Craigslist a week later. But this time, I was smart enough not to click it. I learned my lesson. There are some things in life that just aren't worth the risk, no matter how desperate you are. Some ghosts don't haunt houses, they haunt you.
Next story.
I never believed in ghost stories, at least not until I found myself in the middle of one. But it's not the kind of spooky tale you read in books or hear around campfires. This one came from Craigslist. It all started when I was looking for a roommate. I had just moved to a new city, trying to get a fresh start after a rough breakup. My apartment was small and expensive, so I figured it was time to take the plunge and share a space. I posted an ad on Craigslist, hoping to find someone decent to split the rent. I'd been browsing through a few potential candidates, but they either seemed sketchy or were way too picky about their living situation. That was until I found Emily. Her post seemed perfect. She was looking for a clean, quiet roommate to share a 2-bedroom apartment. She mentioned her love for reading and cooking, and she was a graphic designer who worked from home. She even included a picture. She seemed normal, pleasant enough. The apartment was in a nice neighborhood, just a little outside the city center, so I thought it could work out. I was in a hurry to make a decision, so I texted her and we set up a meeting that evening. When I arrived at the apartment, it looked almost too perfect. The building was older, but it had a charm to it. Exposed brick, tall ceilings, and hardwood floors. There was a large window that overlooked a beautiful garden with ivy creeping up the sides of the building. The smell of lavender and fresh herbs lingered in the air. It felt warm, inviting. Emily greeted me at the door with a warm smile. She was tall, with long brown hair that cascaded down her back in waves. She seemed friendly, calm, and easy to talk to. We sat down, had some coffee, and discussed everything: rent, responsibilities, and schedules. She even gave me a tour of the apartment, showing me the cozy kitchen, like the spacious living room, and of course, my potential room. Everything seemed perfect, but there was one thing I couldn't shake. As we walked past the hallway, I saw a door that I hadn't noticed before. It was tucked away behind a heavy velvet curtain, which seemed out of place in the otherwise clean and minimalistic apartment. I asked Emily about it. "Oh, that room? It's just storage," she said, her smile faltering for a brief moment. "I don't really use it much." Something in her voice sounded off. The way she said storage didn't seem quite right. Too vague, too quick. But I let it slide. I had already convinced myself this was going to be the perfect arrangement. The room itself was beautiful, and I could practically see myself living there. The next day, I moved in. Everything seemed fine at first. Emily was always quiet and pleasant, and she mostly kept to herself, spending a lot of time on her computer in the living room or in her room, working. I would hear her occasionally talking on the phone, but I didn't mind. It was actually kind of nice to have a little peace and quiet. But the weird things started happening shortly after. I began to notice strange noises at night. Footsteps in the hallway, soft whispers that seemed to echo through the apartment, even though there was no one awake. I chalked it up to the creaks and groans of an old building. Maybe the pipes were acting up, or perhaps the wind was making its way through the cracks in the walls. It wasn't anything I couldn't ignore. One night, though, it got worse. I was lying in bed, just starting to drift off to sleep when I heard it. A faint tapping coming from the other side of the hallway. It wasn't the usual creaks, it was a deliberate, rhythmic tapping, almost like someone was knocking, but no one was there. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether I should get up and check. I didn't want to disturb Emily if she was asleep, but the sound kept going, almost insistent. I decided to investigate. I quietly opened my bedroom door, the creaking floorboards beneath my feet making me wince. I tiptoed down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from behind the curtain that covered the door. The one that Emily had mentioned was just storage. I stood there for a moment, listening intently, and the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I reached for the curtain and pulled it aside. The room behind the door wasn't just a storage closet. It was small, but it wasn't empty. The walls were lined with old, dusty furniture covered in sheets, bookshelves, chairs, tables, and a large wooden wardrobe in the far corner. But there was something else. On the floor in the center of the room was a pile of old photographs, scattered haphazardly. They were black and white, faded, and yellowed with age. I bent down to pick one up, and as I did, I felt a strange chill run through me. The photograph was of a woman. Her face was obscured by the flash, but she looked strikingly similar to Emily. I turned the photo over, but there was nothing written on the back. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The door to the hallway was still open. I quickly grabbed the other photos and shoved them in my pocket, making sure to leave everything exactly as I found it. I closed the door behind me and slipped back into my room, my mind racing. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the room, the photos, the feeling that something was wrong. I started paying more attention to Emily, but she was as distant as ever, lost in her own world. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something big. One evening, I decided to confront her. I had to know what was going on. When I found her in the kitchen, making dinner, I asked her about the room behind the curtain. Her expression darkened, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't before, a flicker of fear. She set the knife down on the counter and turned to face me. "I told you it's just storage," she said, her voice tight. "Why are you even asking about it?" I pressed on, refusing to let it go. "I found something in there, Emily, old photos of you." She froze. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then, in a low voice, she finally spoke. "That room, it wasn't always mine." I waited, but she didn't continue. I could see she was struggling with something, but she wasn't ready to talk. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The noise came again, the soft tapping, but this time it was louder, more frantic. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and headed straight for the door, determined to confront whatever was going on. When I opened the curtain again, the room looked different. The photographs were gone. The furniture was in disarray, as if someone had been rummaging through it. And at the center of the room, standing in the middle of the room, was a woman, a figure I immediately recognized. It was Emily, but her eyes were different, empty. She was staring at me, her face pale and frozen in an eerie, expressionless gaze. Before I could move, she spoke, her voice low and hollow. "She's here. She won't leave." And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The room was empty again. Emily was gone, the furniture untouched. But I knew, deep down, that what I had seen was real. The next morning, Emily was gone. Her things were packed up, and there was no trace of her, no explanation, no note. I haven't heard from her since, but I still hear the tapping sometimes, late at night, coming from behind the curtain.
Next story.
It was a rainy Tuesday when I saw the ad that would change my life forever. It was tucked away at the bottom of Craigslist's gigs section, buried under offers for photography assistants and dog walkers. I wasn't even looking for anything unusual that day, just browsing in between work assignments. But this one caught my eye. The headline was simple: "Need someone to clean out an old house, $200 cash." There was no description, no additional information, just the number to call. The lack of details made it stand out to me, and for reasons I still don't fully understand, I felt compelled to reach out. I had no experience cleaning houses, but the pay was decent, and I wasn't opposed to a little extra cash. The idea of doing something different was appealing, and I had the free time to take on a one-off job. I called the number listed in the ad, and a man picked up almost immediately. "Hello?" His voice sounded deep, rough, like he'd been up for days. "Hi, I saw your ad on Craigslist. You're looking for someone to clean out a house?" I asked. Yes, I am. You free today?" He replied, his voice curt, almost impatient. "Yeah, I could do today." "What time?" "Come by around noon," he instructed. "I'll give you the address." I agreed and hung up the phone, trying not to think too much about it. Still, something nagged at the back of my mind, the urgency in his voice, the lack of details. I shrugged it off. It was just a cleaning job. I arrived at the address around 12:30. It was a little outside the city, in an area I wasn't familiar with. The house was set back from the road, half hidden by overgrown trees and shrubs. The grass was long, the driveway cracked and uneven. The place looked abandoned, almost like no one had lived there in years. As I walked up to the door, I noticed there were no other cars in the driveway, no sign of life whatsoever. I knocked on the door, and after a moment, the man answered. He was older than I expected, in his late 60s, with a scruffy beard and unkempt hair. His clothes were worn and ragged, but he didn't seem dirty, just out of place. He looked me over before stepping aside to let me in. "You're here for the job, huh?" he asked, his tone flat. I nodded, feeling suddenly uncomfortable, but trying to ignore the feeling. "Right, it's just cleaning," he said, waving a hand toward the house. "I'll show you what needs to be done." He led me into the living room. It was exactly what I'd expected from an abandoned house, dusty, decayed, and musty smelling. The furniture was covered in sheets, and everything seemed to be coated in a thick layer of dust. Old photographs lined the walls, some cracked and yellowed with age. A large, ornate mirror hung above the fireplace, reflecting a dim, unsettling light. "Everything here needs to be cleared out," he said, his voice still flat. "The sooner, the better." I wasn't sure what clearing out meant, whether it was just dusting and sweeping or something more intense, but he didn't give me much time to ask questions. He handed me a broom and a bucket, then walked away down the hall. I stood there for a moment, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I could feel the weight of the air, the way everything seemed heavy with time. I started with the living room, sweeping the dust away, trying to focus on the task at hand. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The house felt alive in a way that unsettled me, like it was watching me. I didn't know how to explain it, but it was as if the walls themselves were waiting for something. It was about an hour in when I found it. While sweeping behind an old armchair, I noticed a small, strange indentation in the floor, like something heavy had been sitting there for a long time. Curious, I bent down and brushed away the dust. Beneath the surface, I could just make out the outline of something buried under the floorboards. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed a crowbar from a nearby toolbox and pried the boards apart. The floorboards creaked and groaned, but eventually I managed to lift them away. Inside, hidden beneath the wooden slats, was a small, rusty metal box. I froze. Something about the box felt wrong, like it had been waiting for someone to find it. I pulled it out slowly, my hands trembling. The box was old, corroded and covered in dirt, but it had strange markings carved into it. I felt a chill run down my spine as I touched it. The air around me seemed to grow colder. Without thinking, I opened the box. Inside was a bundle of old yellowed papers and a small black and white photograph. The photograph was of a woman standing in front of a house much like the one I was in, though this one looked newer, brighter, alive. The woman was smiling, her eyes wide and clear, but there was something unsettling about her expression, something forced. I quickly shuffled through the papers, but they were all handwritten in a language I couldn't recognize. The markings were like nothing I had ever seen. But it was the last paper, folded and tucked in the back, that caught my attention. It was a single sentence written in English. "If you find this, it's too late." My stomach dropped. I stared at the paper, then back at the photo. The woman in the photo, her eyes seemed to follow me as though she were trying to warn me. I was about to put everything back when I heard footsteps behind me. Found something, did you?" The old man's voice was soft, almost amused. I spun around, my heart racing. He was standing in the doorway, his eyes locked on me with an unsettling intensity. For the first time, I felt genuinely afraid. I didn't mean to. I started, but my voice faltered. The man stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have touched that," he said, his voice cold. "But it doesn't matter now." I stood there, my mind racing. "What do you mean?" The man didn't answer. He simply walked toward the back of the house and stopped in front of a door I hadn't noticed before. It was narrow, hidden behind a curtain. "You should leave now," he said softly. "The house doesn't like visitors." Before I could respond, he opened the door. My breath caught in my throat. Behind it was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I felt the chill from below seep up through the floorboards, sending a shiver down my spine. Without a word, he turned and walked down into the dark. I didn't wait to follow. I grabbed my things, bolted for the front door, and didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking as I drove away, my mind reeling with what had just happened. I never went back to that house. I don't know who that man was or what was in that basement, but whatever it was, I don't think it was meant for me to find. And to this day, I wonder if it's still waiting down there in the dark.
Next story.
I didn't think I'd be one of those people. You know, the ones who get sucked into the dark side of Craigslist. But here I am, recounting a story I wish I could forget. It's a tale that's haunted me ever since, one that makes me double-check every shadow, every flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. It started out so innocently, like it always does. I was looking for a cheap couch, something to fit in my new apartment. Moving across the country to start a new job, I didn't have a lot of money to spare, so like most people on a tight budget, I turned to Craigslist. It was just a simple ad, free couch, slightly used. The ad was posted in the free stuff section, which is always a gamble. You never know what you're going to get, but when you're desperate, you take your chances. The post had no picture, no detailed description, just a brief line saying it was in decent condition and pickup only. I texted the number listed, thinking it would be a quick, easy exchange. The person on the other end responded almost immediately. Their name was Alan, and he said he was giving away the couch because he was moving out of state. He was vague, not offering much about the location or the couch itself, but I figured that was just the nature of Craigslist. The message was unsettling, but I brushed it off. I've always been the type to ignore gut feelings unless they slap me in the face. I asked for the address, and Alan sent me a location in a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of town. It seemed odd that someone would be offering free furniture in such a sketchy part of the city, but I thought maybe he just didn't care about the couch. When I arrived at the address, I immediately regretted it. The house was tucked away at the end of a dead-end street, surrounded by tall, overgrown grass and half-fallen fences. The front porch light flickered, casting an eerie glow on the house's peeling paint. There were no other cars in sight, and I didn't hear anything. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I'm not the type to get nervous easily, but something about this place felt off. Still, I didn't want to be rude. I had already driven across town, and I wasn't about to turn around empty-handed. I rang the doorbell. A few moments passed before the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was a man, but he didn't look like someone who was offering free furniture. His eyes were sunken, his face gaunt, and his clothes looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. His hair was messy, wild even, as if he hadn't seen a comb in ages. "Are you Alan?" I asked, trying to sound confident despite my growing unease. He nodded. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You came for the couch?" I nodded back. "Yeah, I saw your ad. Is it still available?" Alan stepped aside without saying another word and motioned for me to come inside. I hesitated, but I didn't want to seem rude or paranoid. So I stepped through the door, my shoes creaking on the old wooden floor. As I walked through the small, dimly lit hallway, I couldn't help but notice the strange smell in the air, a mixture of mildew and something else, something metallic. The walls were covered with old pictures, but they all seemed to be family photos that had been hastily taken down. The more I looked at them, the more I realized something wasn't quite right. Each frame had been removed from the wall, but the outline of the picture was still visible, leaving an unsettling reminder of something missing. Alan led me into the living room. The couch was sitting in the center of the room, and as soon as I saw it, my stomach sank. It wasn't slightly used, as described in the ad. It was old, tattered, and stained. The fabric was torn in several places, and there was an odd smell that emanated from it, one I couldn't quite place. I turned to Alan. This is the couch?" He nodded, his eyes glinting strangely in the dim light. "Yeah, it's the one. You don't mind the condition, right? It's just a little worn." I looked around the room. The air felt thick, suffocating even. Something wasn't right about this place. The walls were bare, except for a few unremarkable paintings, but there was a heavy, oppressive silence that hung in the air. It was as though time had frozen inside the house. "Actually, I think I'm going to pass," I said, trying to sound casual, but there was an edge to my voice. I didn't want to get caught up in whatever bizarre situation this was. Alan didn't seem to care. He kept smiling that unsettling smile and didn't move. "Are you sure? It's free, you know. You wouldn't have to pay anything. It's just sitting here, and I'm leaving soon." I nodded quickly. "Yeah, I think I'll pass." I turned to leave, but before I could make it to the door, I heard something, a faint sound coming from upstairs. It was a soft, scraping noise like something being dragged across the floor. My heart skipped a beat. I turned back to Alan, my voice shaking. "What was that?" Alan didn't respond. Instead, he slowly stepped closer to me, blocking the door. His eyes were no longer friendly. They were wide, unblinking, as if he was staring right through me. "Something wrong?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. I was frozen, staring at him, but my mind was racing. I had to get out. I had to leave right now. "Please let me out," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want the couch anymore." Alan stepped aside without a word. As I walked toward the door, the scraping noise from upstairs grew louder, and I couldn't help but glance up the stairs. What I saw made my blood run cold. At the top of the stairs, a figure stood motionless, watching me. It was a woman, her hair matted and dirty, her eyes wide and unblinking. She didn't move, just stared at me with a vacant expression, her skin pale and drawn. The sight of her sent a jolt of fear through my chest, and I broke into a run. I slammed the door behind me and bolted down the porch steps, not daring to look back. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short gasps. I drove away, my hands trembling on the wheel, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it some kind of prank? Or had I stumbled upon something much darker than I was prepared for? I didn't know, but one thing was clear. I was never going near that house again. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, not at first. People would think I was crazy, or worse, that I was just making excuses for not getting a free couch. But the memory of that woman standing silently at the top of the stairs will never leave me. It's been a few months now, and I've moved on. But sometimes when I'm home alone at night, I'll hear that same scraping sound. And every time, my heart skips a beat. I don't know what happened to Alan or the woman. I don't know if it was some sick joke or if it was something much worse. But I do know one thing for certain. Craigslist is not the place for anyone to go looking for furniture or anything else. Some things are better left alone.
Next story.
It was one of those nights when you're scrolling through Craigslist looking for something harmless. Maybe a used bike, some cheap furniture, or a temporary gig. I had just moved to a new city, and I was still getting the lay of the land. My apartment was small and temporary, and I was working long hours, so I didn't get out much. But one day, I came across an ad that piqued my curiosity. It wasn't for anything I needed, but something about it made my skin crawl and my heart race. The ad simply read, "Free sofa, must pick up today." The listing was brief. It didn't have any pictures, just a simple description. "Sofa in good condition, must go today, we'll help you load it." There was a phone number, but no name. The posting had been up for a few hours, and something about it made me feel uneasy. I thought about skipping it, but I hadn't bought any furniture yet, and I was in need of a sofa for my living room. The idea of free furniture was tempting, and I didn't want to be picky about the condition of things, especially since I was new to town and not yet settled. I sent a quick text asking if the sofa was still available. Almost immediately, I got a response. Yes, it's still here. Call me when you're on your way, and I'll give you directions. Something about the quickness of the response struck me as odd, but I dismissed it. I needed a sofa, and this could save me a couple $100. I texted back saying I'd be there in an hour. When I arrived at the address, the neighborhood seemed normal at first glance, quiet, suburban, just a few streets over from where I lived, but the house itself gave me an unsettling feeling. It looked off. The windows were covered with thick curtains, and there was an eerie stillness about the place. The front lawn had tall grass, and the paint was peeling off the porch, as though no one had bothered to keep up with it for years. I rang the doorbell, and after a long pause, the door creaked open. Standing there was a man, maybe in his late 50s. He had a thin frame, his face covered in a patchy beard, and his eyes were sunken, almost hollow. He looked at me for a moment without saying anything. The silence stretched on until I awkwardly broke it. "Hi, I'm here for the sofa?" I asked. He nodded slowly, stepped aside, and gestured for me to come in. His movements were deliberate, almost too slow, like he was trying to avoid making noise. I stepped inside, and the first thing I noticed was how dark it was. Even though it was early afternoon, the house felt like it was trapped in perpetual twilight. The air smelled musty, stale, like it hadn't been aired out in years. The living room was full of furniture, but nothing looked right. The furniture was mismatched, old, and looked like it had been collected from various places. But the strangest thing was the lack of any personal touch. No photos, no decorations, no plants. The whole place felt like a museum of secondhand furniture, each piece sitting silently as if it was waiting for something. "The sofa's right over here," the man said, his voice low and raspy. He led me toward the back of the room, where an old, threadbare sofa sat against the wall. It was faded, with patches of discoloration, but I was willing to take it. As I looked closer, I noticed a few strange things about it. The fabric had strange stains on it, darker, redder than I would have expected. And the back of the sofa was worn, like someone had spent years leaning into it with their back. "Looks good," I said, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling crawling up my spine. "How do you want to handle loading it?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just stood there staring at the sofa, his eyes unfocused, as if lost in thought. Then he finally spoke. It's a bit heavy. You might need some help getting it out the door," he said, his voice trailing off in a whisper. "Okay, I can manage," I said, trying to shake off the nervousness. I walked over to the sofa and tried to lift it, but the weight of it was shocking. It felt like there was something wrong with it, like it was heavier than it should be for a piece of furniture. As I struggled, I heard a door creak behind me. The man was standing in the hallway, watching me. He wasn't moving, just staring with his hollow eyes, unblinking. A chill ran down my spine. Something was off. This was not normal. The man didn't look like he was trying to help. He was just watching me struggle with this piece of furniture. "Can you help?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though I was starting to panic. The man said nothing. His lips twitched into something that could have been a smile, but it was unsettling. Too wide, too long. For a moment, I thought about leaving the sofa behind and running out the door, but something held me in place. I was desperate. I needed that sofa. I wanted to just get this over with. I finally managed to drag the sofa a few steps toward the door when something happened. The sofa suddenly felt lighter, almost like something had shifted inside it. As I lifted it again, a loud crack sounded from within the cushions. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice rising with fear. But the man only nodded as if it were normal. I paused, looking at the man, wondering if I should just leave. But then, as if reading my thoughts, he finally spoke. "Don't worry, you'll get it out," he said, his voice a strange, unnatural monotone. I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but my hand was already on the door handle, pushing it open, desperate to escape. As I finally pulled the sofa out onto the porch, I noticed something strange. The cushions had started to shift. They were moving on their own, as if something inside them was squirming. My heart pounded in my chest, and my palms grew clammy. I looked at the man, but he was gone. The door to the house had quietly shut behind me, and when I turned around to look at the sofa again, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The fabric of the cushions was starting to tear, and beneath them I could see something wet and glistening, something that wasn't supposed to be there. The sofa was alive. I froze, paralyzed with fear, and just as I was about to back away, the man's voice echoed from the shadows. "Leave it here. It's better this way." Without thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't care about the sofa, the furniture, or anything else. I ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the main street. When I finally slowed down, gasping for air, I dared to glance back toward the house. There was no sign of the man, no sign of the sofa, just the empty house standing in the distance, as if nothing had ever happened. I don't know what I saw that day, but I'll never forget the feeling of something watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I still don't know what was inside that sofa, or why that man had wanted me to take it so badly, but I learned a valuable lesson that day. Some things that are free come at a much higher cost than you can ever imagine.
Next story.
I don't know what I was thinking when I answered that Craigslist ad. Maybe I just wasn't thinking at all. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, and I was bored. Sitting in my small apartment, flipping through the pages of a magazine, I felt restless. The usual weekend routine had lost its charm, and I needed something new to occupy my mind. That's when I saw it. An ad titled, "Need help with moving? Good pay." The post seemed innocent enough. The person was offering $200 to help with moving some heavy furniture and boxes. It didn't say much else, but it sounded simple enough. It was the kind of job anyone could do, and $200 for a few hours of work sounded pretty decent to me. The location was about a half hour away in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. I figured I'd give it a shot. I sent a quick message offering to help, and within minutes I had a response. "Great, can you come by at 3 p.m.? I'll send you the address." I didn't hesitate. At that point, I just wanted to get out of my apartment and do something. The money was a nice bonus, but it was more about the change of scenery. I packed my things and drove to the address, following the directions on my phone. The neighborhood was peaceful, with well-kept houses and neatly trimmed lawns. It was the kind of place where people had picnics in their backyards and waved to each other across the street. No signs of anything weird. When I arrived, I saw a house that looked like it came straight out of a magazine. Big, but not too extravagant, surrounded by trees. It looked warm, inviting. I parked my car in the driveway and rang the doorbell. A man opened the door. He was middle-aged, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, with a well-groomed beard and thick-rimmed glasses. He was dressed in an old t-shirt and cargo shorts, which seemed a little odd for moving furniture, but whatever. People have their quirks. "Hey there, you must be, Mark, right?" he said, his voice friendly. "I'm Dan. Thanks for coming by. Come on in." I smiled and stepped inside. The interior of the house was surprisingly well maintained. There was a grand chandelier in the foyer, shining dimly from the setting sun. The furniture was all neatly arranged, but it was clear something was missing. The space felt strangely empty, like a home someone was trying to sell. "So, what are we moving?" I asked, trying to make conversation. Dan didn't answer immediately. He looked around for a moment, as though he was searching for the right words. "Not much," he said finally. "A few things, nothing too big." He motioned for me to follow him down the hallway. I noticed how quiet the house was. The only sounds were our footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. As we walked, I realized that there weren't many personal touches around. No family photos, no knickknacks, just the bare minimum. It didn't seem like anyone had lived here for long, but the place also felt too lived in, like someone had been trying to erase their presence. We reached the back of the house where Dan opened a door to what appeared to be a basement. "You'll need to go down there," he said. "It's where I need some help." I hesitated for a moment. The air coming from the basement felt cold, damp even. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling in my stomach and followed him down the narrow stairs. The basement was dimly lit, with just a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with boxes, old furniture, and various objects I couldn't quite make out. But there was something odd about the place. It didn't look like a typical basement at all. At the far end of the room, against the wall, was an old, ornate mirror. It was huge, taller than me, and framed in dark, tarnished gold. The mirror itself was clean, but there was something about the way it reflected the basement that felt wrong. Dan motioned to the mirror. "This is what I need help with," he said. "I want to move it to the living room." I raised an eyebrow. "A mirror? You sure? Looks pretty heavy." "Oh, it's fine," Dan said quickly. "It's just awkward to move, but it's been here for a while, and I'd like it in a better spot." He seemed almost too eager, too insistent. But I figured it was just an odd request. Maybe it had sentimental value to him, who knows? I agreed, and the two of us struggled to move the mirror. It was heavier than I expected, and when I touched it, a strange chill ran through me, but I shook it off. Once we got it upright, Dan smiled. "Perfect. Now I just need you to wait here for a moment." I frowned. "Wait here?" "Yeah, I just need to grab something real quick. I won't be long." I stood there, unsure of what to do. The mirror seemed to draw me in. There was something about it that felt off. I stared at my reflection in the glass, my face looking back at me, but the surroundings were distorted. The basement appeared darker, more foreboding. The reflection was warped, as if the mirror was showing a version of the room that didn't exist. I leaned in closer, almost hypnotized by the strange shimmer on the surface. My heart began to race as I noticed something moving in the reflection. Something I hadn't seen in the room itself. A shadow, dark and formless, shifted behind me. It was as if it was moving in the reflection, but wasn't actually there. I spun around, but the basement was empty. The cold feeling intensified, and I started to feel dizzy. When I turned back to the mirror, the shadow was closer now, looming just behind my reflection. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. What was going on? Dan's voice broke the tension. "Everything okay?" I turned to face him, but before I could speak, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, old-fashioned key. "Just one more thing," he said, his tone suddenly sharp. Without warning, he walked over to the mirror and unlocked something at the base, where a hidden compartment must have been. A loud clicking sound echoed through the basement, and I felt my stomach drop. As the compartment opened, I saw what had been hidden there, a small wooden box intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. Dan reached for it slowly, his eyes fixed on it with an intense, almost obsessive gaze. "This is the last thing," he muttered, almost to himself. I didn't know what was going on, but I felt the urge to leave. Something was very wrong here. "Dan, I think I should go," I said, my voice shaking. He didn't respond, only staring at the box in his hands. As he opened it, a loud, unnatural sound filled the room, a scraping, groaning noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I bolted for the stairs, not looking back. The house felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. I heard Dan's voice faintly behind me, whispering something incomprehensible, but I didn't stop. I ran up the stairs and out the door, not stopping until I was in my car and speeding away. I don't know what Dan was doing with that mirror or the box, but I know one thing for sure: I will never, ever answer another Craigslist ad again.
Next story.
I had just moved to the city, looking for a fresh start. The hustle and bustle were overwhelming, but I was trying to make it work. I didn't know anyone, and I was doing what I could to get by. My apartment was small, barely furnished, and I wasn't about to spend money on unnecessary things. I was scrolling through Craigslist one evening, hoping to find something useful, when I came across an unusual ad. It was listed in the community section under the free stuff category. The title read, "Free Antique Mirror, First Come, First Served." The description was short and to the point. "This antique mirror is beautiful and old. It's heavy, so you'll need help moving it. First person to text gets it. Must pick up today." No pictures, no other details. The words antique and beautiful stood out, but what really caught my attention was the urgency of the post. It was late in the evening, and I figured this was my chance to get something for free. I had always wanted a vintage mirror to brighten up my apartment, and the idea of having something old and unique made it all the more appealing. I texted the number without hesitation. "I'm interested in the mirror. Is it still available?" The reply came almost instantly. "Yes, you can come by right now." There was an address a little further outside the city in an older neighborhood I wasn't familiar with. It seemed odd that someone would be giving away such an old, valuable item, but I was curious and eager. I quickly grabbed my coat, grabbed my car keys, and set off. The drive was longer than expected. The streets grew quieter, the buildings less modern. It was as if I had left the city entirely. The houses grew older, some unkempt, others abandoned. A cold fog began to roll in, and the temperature dropped. It felt like I was entering a place outside of time, where nothing was quite right. I pulled up to the address, a house that seemed lost in the past. It was large, but run down. The lawn was overgrown, and the paint on the walls was peeling. The porch light flickered as I approached, casting long shadows over the yard. The air was thick with a musty, damp smell, like the house hadn't been aired in years. I rang the doorbell. A few moments later, the door creaked open. The man who greeted me was older, with unkempt gray hair and a wrinkled face. His eyes were wide, almost too wide, and he seemed a little too eager. "You came for the mirror, yes?" he asked, his voice raspy but somehow gentle. "Yeah," I replied, trying to mask my unease. "I'm here for the mirror." He smiled, but it was unsettling, too wide, too forced. "Come in, I'll show you," he said, stepping aside. I hesitated for just a moment, but then followed him inside. The entryway was dim, lit only by a few flickering candles, casting strange, dancing shadows on the walls. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I followed him deeper into the house. The hallway was lined with old portraits, some of people I didn't recognize, others I couldn't make out at all. They seemed to be staring at me, their painted eyes following my every move. The man led me to a large room at the back of the house. The walls were adorned with dark tapestries, and the air felt dense, as if something had been stored here for centuries. In the center of the room stood the mirror. It was massive, framed in dark, ornate wood. The glass had an almost unnatural gleam, reflecting the dim light of the room in an unsettling way. As I stepped closer, I noticed something strange. The reflection wasn't just of the room around me, but of something more, something off. The shadows seemed too long, too distorted, and the faces in the reflection weren't mine. I stepped back, startled. "Do you like it?" the man asked, his voice almost a whisper now. Yeah, it's beautiful," I said, though I wasn't sure why I felt so uneasy. Good. You must take it now, before it's too late," he added, his eyes wide again, a manic glint flickering in them. "Too late?" I repeated, unsure of what he meant. "It's been waiting for someone like you," he said, his voice lowering. "It's been calling to you. You just didn't know it until now." My skin prickled. I felt a sense of dread creep into the pit of my stomach, but the thought of leaving without the mirror seemed impossible. Something about it was pulling me in, beckoning me closer. The man gave a small, disconcerting smile. "You'll have no trouble with the weight. It won't be as heavy as it seems. Go ahead, try lifting it." I didn't know why I didn't run at that moment. Maybe it was the strange magnetic pull of the mirror, or maybe I was just too curious. I grabbed the edges of the mirror frame and attempted to lift it. To my surprise, it was light, surprisingly light, almost too light. The wood was solid, but it felt as if the mirror wasn't really there at all, like it was a hollow shell. The instant I lifted it, the reflection in the glass shifted again. This time, I saw a dark figure standing behind me, its face obscured in the shadows, its form barely perceptible. I jerked the mirror back and spun around, but no one was there. I looked back at the reflection. The figure was still there, only this time it was clearer, moving slowly, like it was taking form in the glass. I froze. "You see it now, don't you?" the man whispered, his voice almost a chant. "The mirror doesn't show what's here. It shows what was, what's waiting, and it's been waiting for you." His words were like ice in my veins. I wanted to drop the mirror and run, but my hands wouldn't obey. The reflection was changing, twisting, and I couldn't look away. A sudden sound broke through the tension, sharp and loud. The front door slammed shut. The man's expression twisted into something almost demonic as he lunged toward me. "You shouldn't have taken it," he screamed, but his voice distorted into something that didn't sound quite human. My heart raced as I finally managed to throw the mirror aside, watching in horror as it crashed to the floor. The figure inside the glass screamed, its form distorting and stretching in unnatural ways. I turned and bolted from the room, hearing the man's voice echoing behind me, but I didn't stop. I ran out of the house, through the front door, and didn't look back. The last thing I remember was seeing the mirror on the floor from the window as I sprinted to my car. It wasn't shattered. No, it was still intact. But I could have sworn I saw something standing in front of it, watching me leave. I never went back. I left that part of town behind and told myself it was just my imagination. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I catch myself looking into reflective surfaces, and I wonder if it's really gone, or if it's just waiting for the next person to come too close.
Next story.
I don't know if you'll believe me, but this happened. It happened to me, and I can't shake it off. I wasn't looking for trouble when I went on Craigslist. I was just trying to find some furniture for my new apartment. But what I found instead, well, it's something I wish I'd never seen. I had just moved to a new city. My old place had been small and cramped, but this new apartment was a dream. Well, it would have been if it weren't for the overwhelming emptiness. You know that feeling when you've moved into a new place, but it's bare, no couches, no coffee tables, just empty space. It felt like something was missing, and that made me uncomfortable. I needed furniture. So, after a few hours of scrolling through stores online and finding prices that made my wallet weep, I decided to check Craigslist. I wasn't expecting much, but I found an ad that caught my eye almost immediately. Vintage sofa set, excellent condition, $50 OBO. Must pick up today. The photos were grainy and low res, but the couch looked exactly like the kind of thing I needed. Something old and charming with a bit of history. I thought, for $50, how bad could it be? I texted the number in the ad, and a woman named Gina responded almost immediately. Yes, it's available. The set is in my basement. I'm moving soon and I need it gone. Are you free today? I replied that I could come by, and she gave me an address. It wasn't too far from my new place, just a short drive across town. The excitement I felt was genuine. $50 for a couch in excellent condition? This was a steal. I arrived at the house, an old two-story home in a quiet residential neighborhood. It looked lived in, but not in a warm, welcoming way. The yard had overgrown weeds, and the windows had a dusty, neglected look to them. The house was oddly quiet, no sound of kids playing, no cars passing by, just this eerie, unnatural stillness. I stood outside for a moment, wondering if this was the right place. I knocked on the door, and it creaked open almost immediately. Standing there was a woman in her mid-50s, maybe early 60s. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore an oversized sweater. She didn't look very friendly, but she smiled faintly and stepped aside to let me in. Come in," she said in a voice that was too soft, too insistent. I followed her into the house, and the smell hit me immediately. It was a thick, musty odor, like old books and stale air. The walls were lined with framed pictures. Most of them were of a young woman. She looked familiar somehow, but I couldn't place her. The furniture was old, like the house had been stuck in time. I'll show you the couch, Gina said, leading me to the basement stairs. I hesitated. I don't know why, but something about her made me uneasy, but I ignored that little voice in the back of my head. I wanted the couch, and I needed it. The stairs to the basement were steep, and as we descended, the temperature seemed to drop. It was noticeably colder down there. The basement was dim with only a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. And then I saw it, the couch. It was exactly what I had hoped for. It was a vintage set, plush, and in decent condition. There were a few stains on the fabric, but nothing too bad. Here it is, Gina said, her voice sounding even softer now. I'll help you load it up. But as I moved closer to the couch, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The room was strange. The floor was cluttered with old boxes and piles of newspapers, and there were strange markings on the walls, like someone had scratched at the paint. The air felt thick, like it had been trapped down here for years. I glanced back at Gina, but she was standing in the doorway, her eyes not on me, but on something behind me. I turned, thinking she might be looking at the couch, but instead, I saw a mirror. The mirror was large, and it was covered in a layer of dust, almost like it had been forgotten. But the thing that struck me was that it was positioned right next to the couch, so that when I sat down, my reflection would be staring straight at me. I felt uneasy again. I didn't know there was a mirror down here. Gina's smile tightened. Oh, that mirror's been here a long time. It belonged to my daughter. Something about that struck me, but I didn't question it. Your daughter? I asked, trying to sound casual. Yes, she said. She left years ago. She was always into strange things. There was a brief flicker of something in her eyes, something I couldn't quite place. I tried to focus on the couch, hoping the conversation would change. I really didn't want to think about the mirror or Gina's daughter. Would you like to sit down on it? Gina asked, almost like a suggestion, but it felt like an order. Just to see if it fits, you know. I didn't want to, but I couldn't say no. Something about her tone made me feel like I had to. I sat down. It was comfortable, maybe too comfortable. I could feel the weight of the moment settling in. The air felt thick, oppressive. My reflection in the mirror was clearer than it should have been, almost too clear. I saw my face, my eyes, but something was off. My reflection was wrong. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but no. I stared at my own reflection and I saw it. The woman in the mirror, my reflection, was smiling in a way that I wasn't. A smile so wide it was unnatural. Her eyes seemed darker, deeper, like she was someone else entirely. I jumped up from the couch, heart pounding. What the hell is this? I demanded, turning to face Gina. But when I turned, she wasn't standing in the doorway anymore. She was standing by the basement stairs, her face a mask of cold indifference. You shouldn't have sat down, she said softly. She doesn't like it when people sit on her couch. I backed away, my feet stumbling over the clutter on the basement floor. I had to get out of there. I had to leave. But when I reached the stairs, I heard it, the sound of something scraping against the floor, like fingernails on wood. I turned to look. The reflection in the mirror was moving. It was getting closer to me, step by step. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, driving as fast as I could away from that house. The rearview mirror showed nothing but empty road behind me, but in my mind, I could still see her, my reflection smiling, inching closer and closer. I never went back. I don't know what happened to the couch, or if Gina's daughter ever really left. All I know is that there are some things on Craigslist that are better left unbought.
Next story.
It started as a simple search. I was moving to a new city and needed a few things for my apartment. You know, the usual, cheap furniture, a good coffee table, maybe some decor. I didn't have much, so I relied on Craigslist for affordable options. That's when I came across the listing. Free couch, slightly used, must pick up. The description was brief, stating that the couch had some wear and tear, but was still comfortable. The owner even promised to help load it into my car. The price was right, free, and the couch was listed in a part of town that wasn't far from where I lived, so I figured I'd check it out. The phone number was attached to the post, so I decided to give the owner a call. A man answered on the second ring. Hello? Hi, I saw your ad for the free couch. Is it still available? I asked, trying to sound casual. Yeah, it's still here, he replied. His voice was a little gruff, but not unpleasant. You want to come pick it up? Yeah, I can do that. What time works best for you? I asked. Come by in an hour. I'll be home. I agreed and hung up. I wasn't sure why, but something about his tone left me uneasy. It was a gut feeling I couldn't shake. Maybe it was the lack of details in the ad, or maybe it was because he didn't ask for any specific time, just said, come by in an hour. But I shrugged it off. I needed that couch, and I wasn't going to let a vague gut feeling stop me. When I arrived, I immediately noticed the house was older, tucked away on a quiet, tree-lined street. The lawn was overgrown, and the house itself looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There were no cars in the driveway, and the place seemed eerily still. I didn't think much of it at first. People had different ways of maintaining their properties, after all. I rang the doorbell, and after a moment, the door creaked open. The man who greeted me was tall, thin, and wore a faded t-shirt and jeans. His face was pale, like he hadn't been outside much, and his hair was unkempt, falling over his eyes. You came for the couch? He asked, his voice low. Yeah, I replied, a little unsure now. The man's eyes were oddly intense, staring at me like he was studying me. You said you'd help me load it up? He nodded and motioned for me to follow him inside. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a dark, musty hallway. The air smelled stale, and there was a faint smell of something off. But I figured it was just the house's age, maybe mold. He led me into the living room, where the couch sat right in the middle of the room. It looked older than it had in the picture, stained cushions, faded fabric, and the springs creaked when I sat down. But it wasn't horrible. It was still functional. I could make it work. That's the couch, he said, not moving. His eyes were fixed on me again, this time more intently, as if he were waiting for something. All right, let's get it into my car, I said, trying to sound casual. The man didn't reply. Instead, he stood in the doorway of the living room, watching me, not moving. You're going to help, right? I asked, suddenly feeling uncomfortable. The man smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. It was unsettling, too wide, too empty. You don't need help, he said softly. You'll take it. I stood up slowly, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. Something wasn't right. The way he said it, like he was giving me an order, made me hesitate. I took a step toward the door, my eyes never leaving the man. I think I'll pass, I said, backing away. I don't feel comfortable with this. Thanks, but no thanks. The man's smile didn't fade. Instead, his expression grew darker, more sinister. He stepped forward suddenly, blocking the doorway. His movements were unnervingly quick, like he'd anticipated my reaction. You don't have a choice, he said, his voice now thick with something cold, something almost menacing. I froze. My heart raced, and I could feel the adrenaline surge in my veins. My hands instinctively reached for my phone in my pocket. Get out of my way, I said, my voice shaking slightly. I raised my phone, ready to call the police. The man didn't move, but his eyes darkened. He took a step closer to me, and suddenly, the lights in the room flickered. For a split second, I thought I saw something, an image, a shadow, something standing in the corner of the room. It was like a figure, a dark outline that shouldn't have been there. I looked back at the man, my mind racing. What's going on? Who are you? I demanded. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised a hand and pointed to the couch. You need to take it. It's been waiting for you, he said softly. Waiting for me? I whispered, my blood turning to ice. What do you mean? Before I could move, he lunged toward me, grabbing my wrist with an iron grip. His fingers were unnaturally cold, and I could feel something wrong about the way he touched me. The grip tightened almost painfully. Take it. You're meant to, he repeated, his voice a chilling monotone. In a panic, I wrenched my wrist away and bolted for the door. But as I reached for the handle, the door wouldn't budge. It was like the lock had somehow jammed. I turned, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. The man was still standing in the doorway, watching me. But this time his eyes were different, more distant, empty, like he wasn't really seeing me at all. Leave, I gasped, my voice trembling. Let me out. His lips curled into that same wide, empty smile. You're already here. Suddenly the air grew thick, like something was suffocating the room. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, moving toward me, dark and fluid. Without thinking, I grabbed a nearby lamp and hurled it at the door. The glass shattered on impact, and the door swung open. Without looking back, I ran out of the house, heart racing, barely able to breathe. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, shaking and sweating. I fumbled for my keys and drove away as fast as I could, barely noticing the fog that had settled over the streets, as if the city itself was closing in on me. To this day, I still think about the house and about the man. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I'm certain of one thing. There was something deeply wrong about that place, and I'm convinced that whatever it wasn't a man at all. I deleted the ad the next day, and I've never gone back to that part of town. But sometimes when I'm alone, I wonder if I'll ever be able to shake the feeling that I'm still being watched.